Lavrentiy Beria. That name has been associated with one of the most organized minds of power in Soviet history, a person who did not appear much in public but held in his hands the tools that decided the fate of an entire nation. Born from the distant Caucasus region, he rose from a humble background to become one of the most powerful figures under Joseph Stalin, taking on the role of leading the NKVD from 1938, the key security agency of the state. Under his direction, the security apparatus was reorganized with higher discipline and efficiency, contributing to stabilizing the system after the chaotic period of the Great Purge. During World War II, he participated in supervising the rear, ensuring internal control and mobilizing resources for the Soviet Union's life and death struggle against Nazi Germany. After the war, Beria played an important role in the nuclear weapons development program, coordinating with scientists like Igor Kurchatov to help the Soviet Union successfully test its first atomic bomb on the 29th of August 1949, a turning point that turned this nation into a military superpower and changed the global balance of power. With his organizational ability, decisiveness, and pragmatic thinking, he became one of the architects behind the security and technological strength of the Soviet Union in the crucial period of the 20th century. However, behind those achievements was a painful and controversial reality, as the very apparatus he directed was linked to a deep fear in Soviet society, especially in the years 1937 to 1938, when more than 1.5 million people were arrested and hundreds of thousands were executed, with many others sent into the Gulag system stretching from Siberia to the Far East, where harsh labor conditions caused countless people to not survive. In cities like Moscow and Leningrad, the sound of knocking on doors at night became a symbol of disappearance when families lost their loved ones without explanation, creating a society where fear became a part of daily life. It was Beria himself, in his role as leader of the NKVD, who was associated with maintaining and strengthening that system, a system where power could erase a person from society in just a moment. And even though he rose from adversity to reach the pinnacle of power, his legacy remains tied to those losses and unanswered questions about the price of absolute power. Before continuing, please hit subscribe and leave a like to support the channel, because each of your supports helps us continue to explore these haunting historical stories like this one. Lavrentiy Beria was born on the 29th of March 1990 in the village of Merkuli near Sukhumi, an area in the Caucasus region of the Russian Empire at that time, where living conditions were still very difficult and development opportunities were very limited. His family belonged to the poor peasant class. His father was Pavel Beria, an ordinary worker, and his mother was Marta Jakli, who was said to have had a great influence on the formation of her son's ambitions. In an environment where rising up was almost unthinkable for most people, education became the rare path to changing one's fate, and Beria from an early age was directed toward that path. There were no prominent signs of political ideals in his early life. What was more noticeable in him was his persistence, adaptability, and clear awareness of having to seize every opportunity to advance. In the early years of the 20th century, Beria left his homeland to go to Baku, a city on the shores of the Caspian Sea in what is today Azerbaijan, but at that time was one of the most important industrial centers of the Russian Empire, especially in the oil extraction field. Baku was not only a concentration of major oil companies, but also a crossroads of many social classes, from laborers to engineers, merchants, and political activists. It was here that Beria studied at a technical school in the early 1910s, gaining knowledge in construction and industrial engineering, fields with high applicability in an economy that was rapidly industrializing. Studying in Baku not only gave him a professional foundation, but also placed him in a competitive environment where ability and discipline were valued more than origin. Baku at that time was also one of the places with the most vibrant political activity in the region, with the presence of many revolutionary groups and workers' movements. Although he had not yet participated deeply in politics, Beria could not stand outside these upheavals. He observed how organizations operated, how power was established and maintained, and especially how individuals could advance by attaching themselves to rising forces, Rather than being drawn into ideological debates, he seemed more interested in the structure of power and how to become part of it. This created a clear difference between him and many other revolutionary figures of the same era, who were often driven by strong ideals or political beliefs. The process of studying and living in Baku helped form in Beria some prominent traits: high discipline, the ability to work in an organized way, and secrecy in action. He was not someone who easily revealed his thoughts or emotions, and this later became an advantage in the complex political environment. While many people sought to assert themselves through words or public actions, Beria chose a less noticeable path, focusing on building his position quietly but surely. He understood that in a system where power was concentrated and fiercely competitive, controlling information and keeping personal intentions secret could bring significant advantages. In addition, exposure to the oil industry environment also helped Beria better understand the importance of resources and production in maintaining the strength of a nation. Baku was not only an economic center but also a strategic area where decisions on production and distribution could directly affect the entire system. This may have helped shape his view of power, not just as a political issue but also as the ability to control important resources. These experiences, combined with his technical background and competitive environment, prepared him to enter a new phase, where the skills he had accumulated would be applied in a completely different context, a context where power was not only measured by position, but also by the ability to control people and systems. Those final years of the 1910s marked a major turning point, not only for the Russian Empire, but also for the entire Caucasus region, where Lavrentiy Beria was coming of age. In 1917, two successive revolutions completely toppled the centuries-old Tsarist regime. In February of that year, waves of protests and unrest in Petrograd forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate, ending the Romanov dynasty after more than 300 years of rule. However, the provisional government established afterward could not control the situation as war, economic crisis, and social discontent continued to grow. By October of 1917, the Bolshevik forces led by Vladimir Lenin carried out a coup, overthrowing the provisional government and establishing Soviet power, opening a new chapter in Russian history. This event did not bring immediate stability, but instead pushed the country into a prolonged civil war from 1917 to 1922 between the Red Army, representing the Bolshevik government, and the White Army, which included diverse anti-communist forces ranging from former Tsarist officers to nationalist groups and supporters of liberal democracy. This war was not limited to central Russia, but also spread to the peripheral regions, in which the Caucasus became one of the areas of particularly important strategic significance. With its geographic location between Europe and Asia, along with abundant resources, especially oil in Baku, this region became a target for control by many different forces. During this period, power was no longer determined by title or social status as before, but depended on the ability to control armed force and organization. Cities like Baku, Tbilisi, and surrounding areas constantly changed hands as opposing forces fought for control. Young people like Beria, who were living and studying in this environment, had to adapt quickly to a new reality where survival was tied to siding with the winning force. There was no room for neutrality. Every individual was forced to choose, and that choice was often a matter of life and death. In Azerbaijan, where Beria had studied, the Bolshevik government gradually established control after fierce fighting. In 1920, the Red Army entered Baku, ending the short-lived existence of the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic and bringing the region into the orbit of the emerging Soviet Union. In Georgia, this process happened later but was no less tense. In 1921, the Red Army carried out a military campaign to overthrow the Menshevik government in Tbilisi, establishing the Soviet Republic of Georgia. These upheavals not only changed the political structure, but also created a new system in which power was concentrated in the hands of the Bolshevik Party and their security agencies. In that context, agencies like the Cheka, the predecessor of the NKVD, began to play an increasingly important role. Founded in late 1917, the Cheka's task was to combat counter-revolutionary and sabotage activities. But in practice, the scope of this organization quickly expanded. In the Caucasus, The Cheka directly participated in tracking, interrogating, and dealing with those considered opponents of the new government. The purge campaigns targeted not only opposing armed forces, but also spread to civilians, intellectuals, and anyone suspected of disloyalty. Violence became a frequently used political tool, and the line between war and internal repression became increasingly blurred. For Beria, these years were not only a time of witnessing the collapse of the old system, but also a period when he came into contact with a new system where power was built and maintained through control and coercion. The environment in the Caucasus, with its mix of war, politics, and economics, provided him with real-life lessons on how an organization could operate under unstable conditions. The constant changes of governments, the formation and breaking of alliances, and the presence of many different forces made adaptability and the ability to read situations key factors. At the same time, the process of establishing Bolshevik rule in Georgia and Azerbaijan also opened up new opportunities for those willing to join the apparatus of the new state. Individuals with organizational skills, technical knowledge, and willingness to carry out difficult tasks were given priority for recruitment into administrative and security agencies. In a system being built from scratch, experience and loyalty were often valued more than social origin or academic degrees. This created a relatively clear path for advancement for people like Beria, who not only had a technical background but had also become accustomed to the competitive and highly disciplined environment in Baku. Throughout the Civil War period, purge and repression campaigns continued to expand. Areas that had just come under control often became sites for sweeps aimed at completely eliminating the influence of the opponent. The methods used included mass arrests, quick trials, and in many cases, summary executions. These measures, though highly controversial, were seen as necessary to consolidate the power of the new government in an unstable environment. For those directly involved in these activities, frequent exposure to violence and life and death decisions became part of daily work. As the Civil War gradually came to an end in the early 1920s, the Soviet Union began to take shape as a unified political entity, but the mark of the violent period still remained. Security agencies continued to maintain their important role in monitoring and controlling society, while purge campaigns did not completely end, but only changed in scale and form. In that context, individuals who had proven their ability to operate effectively in chaotic times were retained and advanced in the new system. For Beria, this was the period when the experiences accumulated from the turbulent environment began to transform into concrete advantages on his path into the center of power of the Soviet state. In the context of the Bolshevik government, gradually consolidating control in the Caucasus after the Civil War years, Lavrentiy Beria began to enter the state security apparatus, a path that would shape his entire later career. Around 1920 to 1921, when Azerbaijan and then Georgia successively fell to the Red Army, Beria joined the Cheka forces, the special security agency established to deal with counter-revolutionary activities and maintain power for the new government. This was a time when the Cheka was expanding rapidly, recruiting individuals with organizational ability, willingness to work in harsh environments, and acceptance of tasks that ordinary administrative agencies could not perform. In Azerbaijan, especially in the city of Baku, Beria began to participate in repression activities aimed at eliminating the remaining anti-Bolshevik forces after the new government was established in 1920. These tasks included tracking members of opposing political organizations, monitoring areas suspected of anti-government activities, and participating in arrest campaigns. In an environment where information was often incomplete and the line between suspicion and conclusion was very thin, decisions were made quickly and often decisively. For Beria, this was a period of practical learning about how a security agency operated under unstable conditions, where work effectiveness was measured by concrete results rather than procedures. Work at the Cheka not only required toughness, but also demanded coordination and organizational skills. Beria worked under the Bolshevik security leaders in the Caucasus region who had experience in implementing large-scale repression campaigns. Under their direction, he participated in building information networks, establishing surveillance systems and organizing task execution units. Working in a clearly hierarchical structure helped him understand how power was communicated and enforced from top to bottom, as well as the importance of maintaining discipline in an organization operating in sensitive conditions. When the Red Army entered Georgia in 1921 and established Soviet power here, Beria was reassigned back to his home region and continued his work in the security apparatus. In Georgia, the situation did not become completely stable immediately, as anti-Bolshevik movements still existed, including supporters of the previous Menshevik government and nationalist groups. The Cheka was tasked with quickly eliminating these threats, and Beria participated directly in the sweep campaigns. These activities often took place under conditions of scarce resources and information, requiring flexibility and the ability to make quick decisions on the spot. In the process, Beria began to show certain traits that drew attention within the organization. He was not someone who sought public attention, but he demonstrated the ability to complete tasks efficiently and systematically. Instead of just carrying out instructions, he gradually got involved in planning and organizing campaigns, from allocating personnel to collecting and processing information. The ability to combine technical thinking formed during his studies in Baku with the practical demands of security work helped him create working methods that were more organized than many of his colleagues. One of the important tasks of the Cheka in the Caucasus during this period was to eliminate anti-Bolshevik movements operating scattered throughout the region. These movements, although not strong enough to overthrow the government, still had the potential to cause instability through small-scale attacks, propaganda, and underground organization. Beria participated in campaigns aimed at detecting and destroying these groups, including infiltrating networks, gathering information, and organizing arrest operations. This work not only required toughness but also demanded analytical and assessment skills, since the information collected was often incomplete and needed to be processed to make decisions. In that environment, Beria's reputation began to be built, not through speeches or public political roles, but through work results. He became known as someone who could complete assigned tasks with high accuracy and efficiency, while maintaining control in complex situations. This was especially important in an organization like the Cheka, where mistakes could lead to serious consequences not only for the individual but for the entire campaign. His secrecy in action also helped him avoid unnecessary conflicts and maintain a stable position in a competitive environment. As the Cheka was gradually restructured into the GPU and later the OGPU in the following years, Beria continued to operate in the security system with an increasingly clear role. The experiences accumulated in the early 1920s, from participating in repression in Azerbaijan to campaigns in Georgia, laid the foundation for his further development in the state apparatus. He not only understood how to carry out specific tasks, but also began to grasp how a security system operated on a broader level, from gathering information to implementing policies on the ground. In a state that was being built and consolidated after the Civil War, these skills became important factors that helped him advance further in the coming years. In the early years of the 1920s, when the Soviet government had established basic control in Georgia after the 1921 military campaign, Lavrentiy Beria began to be brought into the local Communist Party apparatus, an important transition from a purely security role to a position with direct influence on the political structure. This appointment took place in the context where the new government needed individuals who had both field experience in repression campaigns and organizational ability to consolidate power at the local level. Beria, with his experience from the Cheka in Azerbaijan and Georgia, fit that requirement and was quickly assigned tasks related to political management and control in the Caucasus region. In Georgia and surrounding areas, resistance to Bolshevik rule did not end immediately after the Red Army gained control. Many different groups, from supporters of the previous Menshevik government to nationalist forces and small armed groups, continued to organize uprisings against the new government. One of the notable uprisings occurred in 1924 in Georgia, when anti-Soviet forces carried out a series of attacks against government agencies and infrastructure. The central government viewed this as a serious threat and deployed strong measures to suppress the movement. In that context, Beria participated in the repression activities, coordinating with security and military units to identify, arrest, and neutralize those considered leaders or participants in the uprising. These campaigns were not merely reactions to specific events, but also part of a broader strategy to establish the party's long-term control in the Caucasus region. Beria participated in building and maintaining local information networks, including recruiting informants, establishing surveillance channels, and monitoring the activities of suspected groups. This system allowed the government to detect early signs of instability and intervene before they developed into larger uprisings. Organizing and operating such a network required close coordination between party and security agencies, as well as the ability to manage information effectively, factors that Beria gradually mastered and applied in his work, alongside the implementation of control measures. Beria also began to build relationships with high-level leaders in the party and the state apparatus. In a system where advancement was often tied to loyalty and work efficiency, establishing and maintaining these relationships was important. He worked in an environment where decisions were usually made at the top and communicated down through implementation, so understanding leaders' expectations and meeting them accurately became a key factor. Through completing assigned tasks, especially in repression campaigns, Beria gradually earned trust from influential figures in the system. In this process, Beria's approach to maintaining order became increasingly clear. Instead of relying on persuasion or reform measures, he focused on using coercive tools to ensure stability. This aligned with the views of many Bolshevik leaders in the post-Civil War period, when they believed that consolidating state power was the top priority. The measures used included arresting suspected individuals, tightly controlling social organizations, and restricting the activities of groups that could cause instability. In many cases, decisions were made quickly to prevent the spread of opposition movements, and the severity of the measures reflected the government's level of concern for maintaining control. Direct participation in these activities helped Beria accumulate more experience in operating a political control system at the local level. He not only carried out directives, but also participated in adjusting implementation methods to suit the specific conditions of each area. This included allocating resources, setting priorities, and coordinating between different units. This coordination ability became one of his strengths, especially in an environment where factors like terrain, ethnicity, and local history could affect the effectiveness of central policies. Meanwhile, the presence of security agencies in the daily life of people in the Caucasus became increasingly evident. Inspections, surveillance, and investigations became part of social reality, and demonstrating loyalty to the government was considered necessary to avoid suspicion. In this context, those responsible for organizing and implementing control policies, like Beria, played an important role in shaping how power was experienced at the local level. Over time, these experiences not only helped him consolidate his position in the region, but also prepared him for the next steps into higher levels of the state apparatus, where similar principles would be applied on a larger scale. In the process of consolidating his position in Georgia and the Caucasus region, Lavrentiy Beria gradually gained access to the highest leadership levels of the party, among which the most important was his connection with Joseph Stalin, who also came from Georgia and had a deep understanding of the region. The geographic and cultural connection created an initial common ground, but the decisive factor remained work efficiency and the ability to meet the demands of the system. In the late years of the 1920s, when Stalin was gradually consolidating power in Moscow after internal struggles within the party, the need for loyal and capable cadres in strategic regions became particularly important. The Caucasus, with its geopolitical position and resources, was among such regions, and Beria, with his experience in security work and local management, began to attract attention. Being noticed by Stalin did not happen through a single event, but was the result of an accumulation process. In internal reports and evaluations, Beria was recorded as someone with the ability to organize effectively, handle complex situations, and maintain order under difficult conditions. He did not stand out through speeches or theoretical roles, but through concrete results in implementing central directives. This matched Stalin's leadership style during this period, when he prioritized those who could implement policies accurately and without question. Beria's secrecy and minimal expression of personal views also helped him avoid unnecessary conflicts in a highly competitive political environment. By the early 1930s, when the policies of agricultural collectivization and industrialization were being implemented across the Soviet Union, the role of local leaders became more important than ever. In 1931, Beria was appointed as secretary of the Communist Party in Georgia, a position that allowed him to directly oversee political, economic, and security activities in the region. This appointment not only reflected trust from the center, but also placed him in a position responsible for implementing the state's major policies. In Georgia, he participated in carrying out collectivization programs, controlling agricultural production, and ensuring that the targets set by Moscow were met. In this role, Beria continued to apply the methods he had developed during his time working at the Cheka and the security apparatus. Maintaining order and achieving targets were placed at the forefront, and coercive measures were still used when necessary. Local security agencies coordinated closely with the party organization to monitor the situation and handle cases considered oppositional. This helped create a relatively tight control system in Georgia while reinforcing Beria's position as someone who could effectively manage a complex region. Throughout the early 1930s, the relationship between Beria and Stalin continued to be strengthened through both official and unofficial channels. Reports from Georgia sent to the center, along with the results of policy implementation, contributed to building Beria's image as a reliable cadre. At the same time, his non-participation in opposition factions within the party helped him avoid political risks during the period when internal purges began to increase. As other high-level leaders were removed or lost their positions, people like Beria, with a relatively clean political record and clear achievements, became more valuable to the center. By the late 1930s, the situation in the central security apparatus had many fluctuations, especially after the period of the Great Purge under Nikolai Yashov. The need to reorganize and stabilize the system became urgent, and Stalin needed someone who could take on this role while still maintaining tight control. In 1938, Beria was summoned to Moscow, marking an important transition from regional leader to direct participation in the center of power of the Soviet Union. This transfer was not only a personal promotion, but also reflected a change in the way the center wanted to manage the security apparatus. In Moscow, Beria was quickly placed into influential positions within the NKVD and related agencies. He participated in restructuring the organization, adjusting operational procedures, and ensuring that the security apparatus continued to serve the political goals of the leadership. In a system where information and control played a key role, holding these positions meant having direct influence over various fields, from internal security to economic and political issues. Stalin, as the head, relied on individuals like Beria to implement decisions and maintain the stability of the system. Stalin's trust in Beria was shown through assigning him tasks related to security and politics at a high level. In a context where many other leaders were replaced or removed, being retained and promoted showed that he had met the important criteria of the system: loyalty, efficiency, and the ability to carry out tasks without causing unwanted disruptions. This relationship was not personal attachment in the usual sense, but a form of cooperation based on interests and functions within a centralized power structure. When Beria began to take on roles in Moscow, he not only brought experience from Georgia, but also applied methods that had proven effective in management and control. The move from the regional level to the center meant expanding the scope of influence, but the basic principles remained the same: gathering information, maintaining surveillance, and ensuring that directives were implemented consistently. In a system where stability depended on the ability to control, those who could operate the apparatus efficiently became indispensable, and Beria gradually affirmed his position among them. After being summoned to Moscow in 1938, Lavrentiy Beria stepped into the center of power of the Soviet Union at a time when the security apparatus was undergoing profound changes after the period of the Great Purge. In November of 1938, he was officially appointed as head of the NKVD, replacing Nikolai Yashov, who had been associated with the most intense phase of the previous purges. This change was not simply an administrative appointment, but a comprehensive restructuring in the way the most powerful security agency of the Soviet Union operated. In the context where Joseph Stalin was seeking to stabilize the system after serious internal upheavals, right after taking over the NKVD, Beria began to carry out a far-reaching reorganization process aimed at restoring the agency's control capability. Units that were dispersed or overlapping were rearranged into a clearer structure, with the centralized command system reinforced from the center down to local levels. He reviewed the cadre staff, removing or transferring those considered ineffective or no longer suitable for the new direction. While the previous period of the NKVD was associated with a high purge rate and uncontrolled expansion, the period under Beria was more organized and systematized, with the goal of maintaining operational efficiency while reducing internal chaos. One of the most important areas that Beria took over was the Gulag system, the network of forced labor camps stretching across the Soviet Union, where millions of prisoners were detained and used as labor force in large-scale industrial and construction projects. Under the supervision of the NKVD, this system not only served a punitive role, but also became part of the planned economy, providing manpower for projects in Siberia, the far north, and the far east. Beria directly participated in managing and optimizing the operation of this system, ensuring that it served both the security and economic goals of the state. Alongside managing the Gulag, Beria also oversaw the expansion of surveillance and control mechanisms across the Soviet Union. The NKVD system, under his leadership, not only focused on arrests and investigations but also expanded to broad information collection about social life, the activities of organizations, and the behavior of individuals. Information networks were established in major cities like Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev, as well as in industrial and rural areas, forming a surveillance structure that covered nearly the entire society. In this environment, information became an important tool of power, and the ability to control the flow of information meant the ability to control social behavior. The NKVD reorganization process also included standardizing investigation and arrest procedures to ensure uniformity across the entire system. Local units were required to strictly follow guidelines from the center and report regularly on their activities. This helped create a more administratively efficient operating system, in which decisions could be implemented quickly and synchronously on a large scale. Beria, with his experience from operations in the Caucasus and Georgia, applied a management method based on tight control and clear hierarchy, helping to strengthen the NKVD's coordination capability nationwide. In the context after the Great Purge, when many high-ranking cadres in the security apparatus had been removed or replaced, Beria became one of the central figures in reshaping the power structure of this agency. The relative stability he brought to the NKVD did not mean a reduction in the role of this agency, but rather a transition from a chaotic purge period to a more systematic control phase. Arrest and surveillance activities continued to take place, but they were placed within a tighter organizational framework, reflecting Beria's pragmatic management approach. Throughout this entire process, Beria's role was not limited to implementing security policies, but also expanded to participating in the overall operation of the state. The NKVD, under his leadership, became an indispensable tool in maintaining political order, controlling society, and supporting the economic goals of the Soviet Union. From supervising major industrial projects to managing the labor camp system, this agency played a central role in the power structure of the Soviet state. As this system was consolidated, Beria's influence within the government also increased accordingly. He was not only the head of a security agency, but also became one of those with direct influence on how the state actually operated. The combination of administrative power, information control, and the ability to implement policies made the NKVD under his time one of the most powerful agencies in the entire Soviet system, and Beria's position in that structure was solidly reinforced in the late years of the 1930s and early 1940s. After completing the reorganization of the NKVD and re-establishing internal order in the security agency, Lavrentiy Beria continued to face the direct consequences of the Great Purge period of 1936 to 1938. a time when the Soviet political system had undergone profound upheaval on an unprecedented scale. Under Joseph Stalin, and especially during the most intense period of activity under Nikolai Yezhov, a series of political cases were carried out across the country, leading to hundreds of thousands of people being arrested, tried, and executed, while many others were sent into the Gulag system under harsh conditions. When Beria took over the NKVD in late 1938, he not only inherited a powerful apparatus, but also inherited a society that had been shaped by deep fear and distrust between individuals. In this period, Beria's task was not only to maintain the operation of the security agency, but also to deal with the consequences of the previous series of political cases. Many investigation files, sentences, and arrest cases needed to be reviewed in the context of the system shifting from a state of chaotic purges to a more organized control model. However, this did not mean a reduction in repressive measures, but rather a transformation in the way they were carried out. Political cases continued to occur, but they were conducted according to stricter procedures with supervision from the center and direct participation of high-level agencies in the security system. One of the important focuses in this period was targeting groups considered to have the potential to threaten the stability of the state, including elements in the military, the intellectual community, and high-ranking party cadres. In a context where the Soviet government considered absolute loyalty the key factor in maintaining power, any sign of suspicion could lead to serious consequences. Internal investigations were expanded, and many important figures in the military and administrative apparatus were placed under surveillance or arrested. This reflected an important characteristic of the political system of that time. The concentration of power came with a high level of suspicion toward those within the apparatus itself. In the military, the purges had left a widespread impact from the previous period, but under Beria, this process continued to be adjusted and consolidated. Officers suspected of disloyalty or connections with opposition groups continued to be removed from the system. This not only changed the leadership structure of the army, but also created an environment in which obedience to orders became the top priority. In the intellectual community, many scientists, writers, and scholars also came under investigation, as research activities and ideas were placed under tight state supervision. Throughout this entire process, the NKVD under Beria's leadership played a central role in implementing security policies. This agency not only carried out arrests, but also participated in coordinating the court system, supervising the investigation process, and ensuring that decisions were implemented uniformly nationwide. Hundreds of thousands of people were arrested in the late 1930s, and many of them were sentenced to death or sent to labor camps. Although the scale of the purges tended to decrease compared to the previous peak period, the level of social control remained very high. Alongside these activities, Beria also focused on consolidating power through information control. In a system where information played a decisive role in shaping social perception, controlling the press, documents, and communication channels became an important part of the management strategy. The NKVD participated in monitoring published content, tracking information exchange activities, and ensuring that views circulated in society aligned with the state's direction. This helped minimize the possibility of forming organized opposition groups and maintain unity in the political system. In addition, fear continued to serve as an effective tool of social control. In many cases, there was no need for direct coercive measures, because the mere possibility of being monitored and the risk of investigation were enough to shape individual behavior. People in major cities like Moscow, Leningrad, or Kiev lived in a state of constant alertness where social relationships were limited by suspicion and caution. In this environment, the NKVD was not only an administrative agency, but also became a structural element of social life. Beria's role in this period could not be separated from the broader context of the Soviet political system. He was not the initiator of all the purges, but the one who took over and adjusted an apparatus that had been established earlier, while ensuring that it continued to operate according to the goals of the state. The shift from a chaotic phase to a more organized phase in security operations showed a change in management approach, in which efficiency and systematization were placed at the forefront. Throughout the late 1930s, as Europe was approaching a new war, The Soviet Union under Stalin's leadership and with Beria's important participation had built an internal security system tighter than ever. This system was not only aimed at dealing with external threats but also focused on comprehensive control of internal society. In that structure, the NKVD became one of the most important tools of power, and Beria, in his role as head, became one of the central figures in maintaining and operating this control mechanism on a nationwide scale. After the final phase of the Great Purge, when the security apparatus had been restructured and controlled more tightly under Lavrentiy Beria, the Soviet Union entered a new decade with global-scale upheavals. In 1939, World War II officially broke out in Europe, and only 2 years later, on the 22nd of June 1941, Nazi Germany under the leadership of Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the large-scale invasion of the Soviet Union. This war was not only a military confrontation, but also became a war of survival for the Soviet state, in which the entire political, economic, and security system was placed in a state of maximum mobilization. In the early days of the war, the situation on the Western Front became extremely serious as German troops advanced rapidly through Soviet territory, causing the collapse of many important defensive lines. In that context, the task of the security apparatus supervised by Beria was not limited to maintaining internal order, but also expanded to ensuring the survival of the state under conditions of total war. One of the most important tasks in this period was organizing the relocation of the entire industrial system from the western regions, like Ukraine, Belarus, and the European part of Russia to the east, especially to the Ural region, Siberia, and Kazakhstan. This was a gigantic logistics campaign involving the dismantling of thousands of factories, transporting equipment over thousands of kilometers, and re-establishing production in the shortest possible time. Alongside the industrial relocation process, population control also became an important part of the Soviet war strategy. Millions of civilians were evacuated from war zones to safer areas in the east, while security agencies closely monitored this movement to prevent spies or suspected elements from infiltrating the interior. The NKVD under Beria's direction played a central role in organizing and supervising these activities, ensuring that the relocation process proceeded according to plan and did not cause chaos beyond the state's control. In the context of fierce war, the issue of internal security became particularly sensitive. The Soviet government was concerned about the possibility of groups cooperating with the German army or carrying out sabotage activities from within. Therefore, the NKVD was tasked with investigating, arresting, and in many cases punishing individuals or communities suspected of having connections with the enemy. Ethnic minority groups in some border areas were also placed under special surveillance, and in some cases, forced relocation policies were applied to eliminate the risk of being considered unreliable from a security standpoint. In the army, the role of the security system was also strengthened to maintain discipline and combat capability under extremely harsh conditions. The NKVD established special units within the army, tasked with monitoring fighting spirit and preventing desertion or unauthorized retreats. In some cases, harsh measures were applied to ensure that combat units obeyed orders in a context where the collapse of the front could occur at any time. These measures reflected the extremely high level of tension in the war, where the survival of the state was placed above all other factors. Lavrentiy Beria, in his role as one of the main people responsible for internal security and rear organization, participated directly in coordinating many important aspects of the war effort. He not only supervised the NKVD's activities in controlling society, but also participated in decisions related to resource allocation and the organization of war production. In a system where the boundaries between military, economic, and security were almost erased, his role expanded beyond the traditional scope of a secret service agency. Throughout the period of 1941 to 1943, when the war situation reached its highest level of tension, especially in major battles like the Battle of Stalingrad, the internal control system continued to be maintained and even strengthened. Maintaining discipline in the army and stability in the rear was seen as a key factor in ensuring the ability to defeat Nazi Germany. In that context, the security agencies played an indispensable part in the structure of total war, where all national resources were mobilized for the single goal of survival. When the war gradually shifted to the counteroffensive phase after 1943, the Soviet Union began to regain lost territories and advance deep into German territory. In this process, the security agencies continued to participate in managing newly liberated areas, re-establishing administrative order, and supervising areas that had just experienced combat. Beria's role in this period still carried a coordinating and controlling character at a high level, reflecting his central position in the power structure of the Soviet state during the war period. By the time World War II ended in 1945, the Soviet Union had become one of the victorious great powers, but the price paid was extremely high in lives and property. Throughout that entire process, the internal security system, with Beria as one of the key operators, had played an important role in maintaining the stability of the rear and ensuring the comprehensive mobilization of national resources. This created a foundation for the post-war period, when the Soviet Union entered a new power competition on the international stage. After World War II ended in 1945, the Soviet Union entered a new phase of global competition, as the world quickly shifted from the war against fascism to a new order of confrontation between superpowers. In that context, the development of nuclear weapons became the top strategic priority of the Soviet state to ensure a balance of power with the United States. It was at this time that Lavrentiy Beria was assigned one of the most secret and important tasks in modern Soviet history, leading the atomic bomb development program. From 1945, Beria directly supervised Project No. 1, the code name for the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons program. Under the direction of Joseph Stalin, he was given authority to control the entire organizational mechanism, from resource allocation and security supervision to coordinating scientific and technical groups. One of the most important scientists in the project was Igor Kurchatov, who was assigned the task of researching and developing the atomic bomb design. Beria was not a scientist, but he played a central role in ensuring that all necessary resources were provided in full and on time, despite the difficult post-war conditions. An important factor that helped the Soviet nuclear program advance faster than expected was the collection of intelligence information from the West. During this period, spy networks provided the Soviet Union with much data related to the United States Manhattan Project, including design principles and important technical information. This information was passed to Soviet scientists and served as an important reference source in the weapons development process. Beria was responsible for supervising all intelligence activities related to the project, ensuring that information flows were collected, analyzed, and transferred efficiently within the research system. Alongside scientific and intelligence activities, the nuclear program also relied on a huge resource system mobilized from the Soviet Union's centralized planned economy, which included the Gulag system. Tens of thousands of forced labor prisoners were used in raw material extraction, infrastructure construction, and support for industrial projects related to nuclear research. Remote areas like the Ural region and Siberia became important production centers, where secret facilities were built to serve the weapons program. Under the supervision of the NKVD, the use of forced labor became part of the logistics system serving the national strategic goal. Throughout the period from 1945 to 1949, Beria held the role of coordinating the entire development process, ensuring coordination between scientists, engineers, security agencies, and industrial organizations. He regularly reported directly to Stalin on project progress while handling issues related to security, confidentiality, and organization. In a system where secrecy was placed at the forefront, information control became a key factor, and Beria was the one responsible for ensuring that the entire program was kept in absolute safety from external surveillance. The peak of the program occurred on the 29th of August, 1949, when the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. This event marked an important turning point in 20th century history, when the Soviet Union officially became the world's second nuclear power, breaking the United States' nuclear monopoly. This success was not only of military significance but also had a profound impact on the global balance of power, opening a new phase of the Cold War. Throughout this entire process, Beria's role was more coordinating and controlling than purely scientific, but it had a direct influence on the final outcome. His ability to organize, manage resources, and ensure security helped the nuclear program operate under extremely complex conditions, where pressure on time, secrecy, and international competition was at its highest. Under his supervision, one of the most important scientific projects in Soviet history was successfully completed, creating a strategic turning point for this nation on the international stage. After the Soviet nuclear program was successfully completed in 1949, Lavrentiy Beria entered the highest power phase of his career, when he was not only one of the heads of the security apparatus, but also a central figure in national strategic programs. However, alongside the image of a powerful official in the state system, there existed another less publicized aspect related to his personal life in Moscow, where he lived with his family in the post-war years. Beria married Nina Gakori from the 1920s, during the period when he was still active in the Caucasus region. This marriage was formed in the turbulent political and social context of the early Soviet period, when many personal relationships were also influenced by living conditions and work in the revolutionary apparatus. Nina was known as someone who lived discreetly, rarely participated in public political activities, and most of her life was tied to the family role. Throughout the time Beria advanced in the security and political system, his family mainly lived in Moscow, where he frequently moved between central agencies and high-level meetings. His son Sergei Beria grew up in the special environment of the Soviet leadership circle. Later, Sergei pursued a career in military engineering, working in fields related to defense technology and technical research. His career partly reflected the general trend among the children of high-level Soviet leaders, where engineering and military fields were often considered suitable for the state structure. However, the relationship between Beria and his son, as well as family life in general, was not recorded much in official documents, reflecting the secretive and separate nature between his personal life and political work. Beria's family life in Moscow took place in a privileged but also tightly controlled environment, as he was one of the figures with great power in the national security system. His residence was strictly guarded and personal activities often occurred separately from official work. In historical records, Beria was often described as someone who maintained a clear distance between his public role and private life, a common characteristic among high-level security leaders of the Soviet Union during this period. However, alongside that relatively stable family image, many historical sources and later testimonies also mention serious accusations related to Beria's personal behavior in Moscow, especially during the late 1940s and early 1950s. These accusations included abusing power to approach and coerce a number of women, often young people or those with indirect connections to state agencies. These events, according to many accounts, took place in a context where Beria's power in the security system had reached a level that was almost unchecked, and supervision of high-ranking officials was often very limited. These accusations contributed to creating a complex image of Beria, when his personal life was perceived as a world completely separate from his public role in the government. While at the state level he was the one directing strategic programs, managing the security system, and participating in important decisions of the Soviet Union. At the personal level, he was described in many sources as someone whose behavior went beyond the usual moral framework of that period. However, the accuracy and scope of these accusations remain a subject of debate among historians due to the limited nature of the documents and the complex political context after he was removed from power. The parallel existence of two images, a powerful leader in the state system and an individual with a highly controversial private life, reflects a common characteristic of many figures in the Soviet security apparatus during the Stalin era. In a system where power was highly concentrated and information was tightly controlled, the boundary between the public person and the private person often became blurred or completely hidden. For Beria, this became even clearer as he held a central position in both the security system and the national strategic programs. In the early years of the 1950s, when Joseph Stalin's health began to decline, Beria's role in the system continued to expand. But at the same time it also became more politically sensitive. The combination of public power and accusations related to his personal life created a complex image that helped shape how he was perceived in the final phase of his career. In that context, The separation between family life in Moscow and his role in the state apparatus was not only a personal characteristic, but also reflected the broader structure of the political system he was serving. After World War II ended in 1945, the Soviet Union entered a phase of power restructuring and global influence expansion. In that context, Lavrentiy Beria became one of the most influential figures in the entire Soviet political system. From his position as head of the security apparatus during the war, he gradually expanded his power into civilian, economic, and foreign affairs fields, becoming one of the most important pillars of the state in the post-war period. Under the supreme leadership of Joseph Stalin, the power structure of the Soviet Union was centralized more strongly than ever, and Beria held a central role in this system. He continued to hold important positions in the Council of Ministers and the Politburo, where the country's strategic decisions were made. Not limited to the security field, his influence spread to areas such as defense industry, scientific development, intelligence, and management of special state programs. The combination of administrative power and security control made his position particularly important in the Soviet power structure. One of the key areas that Beria continued to control was the national intelligence and security system, which he had built and restructured in the late 1930s. After the war, this system not only focused on internal threats, but also expanded to international espionage activities, especially in the context where the Cold War began to form between the Soviet Union and Western countries. The collection of information on military technology, strategic plans, and political activities of rival nations became an important part of the national strategy, and Beria played a coordinating role in many activities related to this field. Besides security and intelligence, Beria also participated directly in strategic projects of a national character, including the development of the defense industry, the expansion of nuclear capabilities, and the construction of important research facilities. After the success of the atomic bomb program in 1949, the Soviet Union continued to invest heavily in the development of nuclear weapons and related technologies to maintain strategic balance with the United States. Beria, with his organizational and control experience from various fields, was assigned to supervise and coordinate many aspects of these programs. In the field of foreign affairs, Beria's influence also began to expand, especially in shaping the power structure in Eastern Europe after the war. After 1945, many countries in this region fell within the Soviet Union's sphere of influence, and the process of establishing pro-Soviet governments was implemented quickly in Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. Although major political decisions were still made by Stalin and the Politburo, Beria participated in implementing and supervising the security policies related to this process, ensuring that the new governments were established according to a model suitable for Soviet interests. In that context, Beria's role was not only that of an executor but also a coordinator between different agencies in the power system. He participated in ensuring coordination between the military, intelligence, and administrative agencies in the process of establishing Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. This included supervising security activities in the new countries, monitoring opposition movements, and supporting pro-Soviet governments in consolidating internal power. His influence, therefore, was no longer limited to the Soviet Union, but had expanded to a larger geopolitical space. Within the Soviet Union, Beria's power reached its highest level in his career. He was not only an important member of the Politburo, but also one of those who could directly influence the state's strategic decisions. In a system where power was highly concentrated in a small group of leaders, his position made him an irreplaceable figure in many fields. However, this very expansion of power also increased the level of political sensitivity around him, as internal leadership relationships became increasingly complex. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Soviet Union entered a new phase of Cold War tension, with increasingly clear confrontation with the United States and its Western allies. In that context, the security and intelligence agencies played a key role in protecting national interests, and Beria continued to hold a central position in coordinating these activities. He supervised the collection of information, analysis of the opponent's strategy, and ensured that the Soviet Union maintained its competitive position in the global arms and technology race. The combination of internal power, foreign influence, and his role in strategic programs made Beria one of the most powerful figures in the entire post-war Soviet system. However, this very concentration of power also created latent tensions within the leadership, as relationships among high-level members became increasingly complex in the context of generational transition and changes in the power structure. In this period, Beria was not only the one operating the system, but also became an inseparable part of the power structure that was shaping the future of the Soviet Union in the Cold War era. When Lavrentiy Beria's power reached its peak in the Soviet system after 1945, the political order that seemed to have been fixed once again was shaken by a turning point event. On the 5th of March 1953, Joseph Stalin died after many years of absolute rule. Stalin's death not only ended an era but also opened up a huge power vacuum in the center of Soviet politics, where there was no clear immediate successor. In the first hours and days after Stalin's death, the high-level leadership apparatus of the Soviet Union fell into a state of both mourning and political calculation. Members of the Politburo quickly gathered to determine the next direction for the country, while the balance of power that had been maintained under Stalin's hand began to dissolve. In that context, Beria acted quickly to consolidate his position, especially through control of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the MVD, the agency that succeeded and expanded the previous role of the NKVD. Beria's takeover of the MVD was not only administrative but also carried deep strategic significance. This apparatus controlled the police, internal security, the labor camp system, and a large part of social surveillance activities across the Soviet Union. With this agency in his hands, Beria possessed a powerful tool capable of directly influencing every level of political life. In the first weeks after Stalin's death, he began to carry out some important adjustments in policy, including reviewing political cases and proposing the release of some prisoners held for political reasons. These proposals, especially the release of some political prisoners and the reduction of repression levels in the security system, created mixed reactions within the leadership. Some saw this as a pragmatic step to stabilize society after many years of tension, while others viewed it as a sign of power restructuring that could threaten the positions of other factions in the party. In a system where power was always tied to security control, any change in policy carried deep political significance. Among the high-level leaders, Nikita Khrushchev began to emerge as an important figure in balancing Beria's influence. Khrushchev and his allies in the party became increasingly concerned that Beria's control of the MVD, combined with his ability to influence security and administrative agencies, could lead to a concentration of power beyond the limits of collective control. This created a tense atmosphere within the leadership where political discussions revolved not only around policy direction, but also directly concerned the survival of factions. In the first months of 1953, the political situation in Moscow became particularly sensitive. Politburo meetings took place in an atmosphere of caution, as every move was closely monitored and analyzed. Beria, with control over the security apparatus, had a significant advantage in gathering information and tracking developments within the government. However, this very fact also made other leaders increasingly wary of him, as the concentration of power in the hands of a single individual was seen as a risk to the collective leadership structure that was forming after Stalin. Alongside policy changes, Beria continued to push for some adjustment reforms in the MVD system. He directed the review of some political case files, reduced some harsh control measures, and partially restructured the prison camp system. These moves, although they did not immediately create widespread change, sent a clear signal that the security system was entering a new adjustment phase. However, in a highly suspicious political context, every change could be interpreted in different ways, and not all were viewed positively in the eyes of political opponents. Tension within the Soviet leadership therefore increased steadily. Informal discussions, secret meetings, and behind-the-scenes exchanges became no less important than official decisions. Beria, with his position controlling security, was both a participant in this process and the object being monitored by other sides. The balance of power that had been maintained under Stalin no longer existed, and a new competition was gradually forming to determine who would shape the future of the Soviet Union in the post-Stalin period. In that context, Stalin's death was not simply the end of an individual leader, but also the starting point for a phase of profound power restructuring throughout the entire Soviet political system. And in that unstable transition period, Lavrentiy Beria became one of the central figures, both holding the greatest power in his career and facing increasingly growing political risks from those who had once been allies in the highest leadership apparatus of the Soviet Union. After the death of Joseph Stalin in March of 1953, the power struggle within the Soviet leadership became increasingly tense as factions began to reshape the new political order. Lavrentiy Beria, with his control of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the NKVD, and the internal security system, became one of the most powerful figures in this transition period. However, this very concentration of power also made him the target of growing concerns among the high-level leadership, especially the group around Nikita Khrushchev. In the months after Stalin's death, Politburo meetings took place in an atmosphere that was both cautious and full of calculation. Beria continued to maintain his central role in controlling the security system, while promoting some reform proposals, including reviewing political cases and reducing the level of repression in the prison camp system. However, these moves did not reduce suspicion from political opponents. On the contrary, they were interpreted as an effort to consolidate personal power in an unstable power transition period. The climax of this process occurred on the 26th of June, 1953, when Beria was arrested right during a meeting at the Kremlin. The arrest was carried out suddenly, with the coordination of specially mobilized military and security forces to ensure that he could not use his power in the NKVD system to resist. This event marked an important turning point in the internal power struggle, when one of the most powerful figures in the Soviet security apparatus was removed only a short time after Stalin's death. After his arrest, Beria was quickly placed under investigation, with a series of serious accusations, including treason, abuse of power, and serious violations during his time holding high positions in the security apparatus. These accusations reflected not only actions from the period when he led the NKVD and NKVD, but also the result of the ongoing political restructuring, in which his opponents sought to completely eliminate his influence from the new power system. Beria's trial was held under secret conditions at the end of 1953. The process took place quickly, without publicity, and did not allow any significant defense from the defendant. In the political context of that time, the trial was not only legal, but also deeply political, as it marked the end of a period of power tied to the Stalin-era security system. The result of the trial was a death sentence for Beria, with the charges confirmed by a special military court. On the 23rd of December 1953, Lavrentiy Beria was executed by firing squad in Moscow. His death took place in silence without widespread publicity, reflecting the politically sensitive nature of the case. This event marked the complete collapse of one of the figures who had once held the greatest power in the Soviet system. In just a few months after Stalin's death, the balance of power had changed completely, and Beria, from his central position in the security apparatus, became a target removed by the very system he had helped build and operate. In the broader context, Beria's downfall reflected the profound power restructuring process in the post-Stalin Soviet Union. When new leaders sought to eliminate elements considered dangerous to the emerging collective leadership model, the accusations against them, although legal in nature, also carried clear political significance, as they were used as tools to reshape the new power order. In this process, the security system that Beria had once controlled was transferred and reorganized under the supervision of the new leaders, marking the end of one era and the opening of another in Soviet history. After Lavrentiy Beria was executed by firing squad in December of 1953, the story about him did not end in the historical sense, but began to enter a more complex phase of evaluation, where his personal role was placed in relation to the entire system he had served and helped build. In the power structure of the Soviet Union during the Stalin era, Beria was not just an individual holding an office, but also an important link in the operating mechanism of the security state, where power, control, and fear were tightly intertwined. Throughout many decades of existence, the NKVD and later the NKVD in its various forms had become the center of the Soviet Union's internal control apparatus. Under Beria's leadership in the late 1930s and during the war, this agency not only carried out traditional security tasks, but also participated in comprehensive surveillance of society, from politics and economics to personal life. The Gulag system, which had already been expanded from Stalin's time, continued to exist as part of the state structure for many decades afterward, with millions of people passing through the forced labor camps stretching from Siberia to the Far East. These mechanisms did not disappear with the death of individual leaders, but continued to shape the way the Soviet state operated in the post-war period. When looking back at Beria's role, one of the central issues in historical circles is the degree of his personal responsibility in operating and expanding this system. Comparisons are often made between him and other figures in totalitarian regimes, such as Heinrich Himmler, the head of Nazi Germany's security apparatus. Both held important roles in organizing security agencies with broad control scopes, participating in the implementation of large-scale repressive policies, and operating systems of prisons or forced labor camps. However, the political context, state structure, and decision-making mechanisms in these two systems also had significant differences, making direct comparisons always a controversial topic. In the case of the Soviet Union, power was not completely concentrated in a single individual throughout the entire period of the system's existence, but was divided within a complex party-state structure, in which major decisions were usually made by the collective high-level leadership. However, in actual operation, individuals holding positions like Beria had direct influence on policy implementation, especially in the field of security and social control. This created a situation in which personal responsibility and system responsibility could not be easily separated, because individual actions were always carried out within the framework of a larger power mechanism. The debate about Beria therefore does not only revolve around the question of who he was, but also concerns the question of how the system created him and how he helped shape that system. In a totalitarian regime where information was tightly controlled, opposition was eliminated, and power was highly concentrated, individuals in security leadership positions were often both executors and designers of control mechanisms. This blurred the line between individual will and system requirements, making ethical and responsibility evaluations more complex than in other political models. An important question raised is what the nature of power in totalitarian regimes is, and how a system can create mechanisms in which violence and control become normal tools of state governance. In the case of the Soviet Union, the security system was not only a tool to protect the state, but also became part of the operational structure of society, influencing the way people lived, worked, and interacted with one another. Beria, in his role as the head of an important part of this system, became a symbol of the intersection between organizational ability, political power, and coercive mechanisms. When looking back at his entire career, from the early years in the Caucasus through the Civil War period, the Purge era, World War II, and the early Cold War, one can see a continuous process in which the individual and the system could not be separated. Beria was not only a product of the Soviet system, but also one of those who helped shape it in its most important stages. At the same time, that system also limited and directed his behavior, creating a framework in which power was exercised according to its own rules. Ultimately, the story of Beria raises a broader issue beyond the individual himself. In systems where power is highly concentrated and social control is considered the top priority, how fragile the boundary between protecting the state and repressing society can become. And in that context, responsibility belongs to whom? The individual, the system, or both, remains a question that does not easily have a definitive answer. The story of Lavrentiy Beria, from a boy born into a poor peasant family in Merkuli, to the head of the NKVD, and a central figure in the Soviet power apparatus, shows how a person can be completely shaped by the surrounding political environment and power structure. The details in his journey, from participating in the Cheka during the Civil War, suppressing anti-Bolshevik movements in the Caucasus, to controlling the Gulag system with millions of prisoners, reflect a cold reality that in totalitarian systems, organizational ability and loyalty can be placed higher than any personal moral standards. His supervision of the purges in the late 1930s, control of information, and maintenance of fear as a tool of social management show that power lies not only in orders but also in the ability to shape the reality in which others must live. For an American audience, this story is an important reminder about the value of institutions that check power. In a democratic society like the United States, where power is distributed among the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, transparency and public oversight are the barriers that prevent the abuse of power on a systemic scale. If we look back at how Beria operated the NKVD, from expanding surveillance over all of society, controlling information, to using a network of fear to maintain order, we can clearly see the consequences when control mechanisms are removed or neutralized. Even in wartime, when the Soviet Union mobilized all its resources to fight Nazi Germany, those extreme control methods continued to expand, showing that crisis can become a reason to strengthen concentrated power. The lesson drawn is not only in evaluating an individual like Beria, but also in understanding how a system can turn ordinary people into tools of power. What is important for American people is to maintain vigilance against any form of power concentration that could undermine individual freedom, even under the name of security, stability, or national interest. Beria's history shows that when fear becomes a tool of governance, and when information is controlled, the boundary between order and repression can be erased very quickly. This is a reminder that freedom is not only protected by law, but also by the continuous and conscious participation of society in overseeing power. If you find the story about power, fear, and how a system can change human destiny interesting, please hit subscribe so you do not miss the next historical journeys. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we continue to unpack the mysteries behind the figures who changed the world.